All right, 7:01, time to get going. Thanks for joining us, everybody. We're glad you could be here with us on this semi-spring day we had today. Nice and sunny, made me excited to get out there and start planning gardening projects. And I hope it was sunny wherever you're joining us from tonight. So welcome to the Nurturing Nature in Our Neighborhood, in your neighborhood, sorry, webinar. Whoops, let's see here. My name is Becca Robinson, and we are Reep Green Solutions, an environmental charity based in Waterloo region. That's been helping people in the area live sustainably for over 20 years, almost 25 years. Our mission is to empower the community with the practical tools, knowledge, and capacity for making sustainable living the norm. We have a variety of programs at Reep Green Solutions. So we help people work on home energy efficiency, water conservation, healthy yards, and waste reduction. I've told you our mission, but what are our more practical guiding statements is here. For the 10 years between 2020 and 2030, we're working towards individually and collectively achieving 10,000 meaningful actions so that together our community can shift to a resilient low carbon future. And so over these 10 years, we're engaging with the public, developing programs, and helping people take sustainable action and counting them along the way with the goal of reaching 10,000 real tangible actions in the Waterloo region and wider community by 2030. So my name is Becca Robinson. As I said, I'm the Director of Climate Adaptation Programs at Reep. I have a landscape architecture background in environmental science, and I've been working with Reep for about 6 years and have helped hundreds of homeowners make sustainable changes in their landscape that promote biodiversity, wildlife habitat, and overall watershed health. And I'll talk to you more about how your yard can contribute to that shortly. And I'm joined tonight by my colleague, Aaron, who will introduce himself now.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for joining us tonight. Like Becca said, my name is Aaron. I'm Reep's Tree Operations Coordinator. So I mainly facilitate our backyard tree planting program and a few other tree kind of related projects. So I also have a background in environmental science and am a ISA certified arborist. I've been with Reep for a little bit over 2 years, and I'm definitely still learning a lot about caring for our properties. So before we get too far into the presentation tonight, I do want to take a second to acknowledge that we're on the traditional territory of Indigenous peoples, namely the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. So these people are the original stewards of the land, and I think it's important that we remember that throughout this presentation. Much of my education and much of this presentation is from a pretty Western or colonial view of horticulture. And there are really many valuable stories that can be learned from the original peoples of this land. So I'd like to start by sharing one of my favorite stories that relates to the Great Tree of Peace, which is also an eastern white pine and is Ontario's provincial tree as well. According to an oral tradition at the Confederacy of the Five Nations over 1,000 years ago, the Five Nations were warring, but they were approached by a man named the Peacekeeper. Or sorry, I think it was actually the Peacemaker. So he approached the nations and told them to cast aside their weapons, to come together in peace and bury their weapons under an eastern white pine. So this is actually also where the phrase "bury the hatchet" comes from. And yeah, I always think that kind of story is interesting. So the Five Nations came together, buried their weapons, and under an eastern white pine, which is why it's known as the Great Tree of Peace. So another kind of interesting fact there about the white pine is that its needles are in bundles of 5. So that kind of represents those 5 nations in Haudenosaunee culture as well, as they kind of come together and form this one tree. The story also shows that when you when you nurture peace, it continues to grow. So I think that's a great story, and I encourage you to learn a little bit more of it online if you're interested.
Thanks, Aaron. So tonight's program is brought to you by Rain Smart Neighborhoods, which is the program we are running in partnership with the city of Kitchener. So hopefully many of you tonight are from Kitchener area. This program is designed to help residents in target subwatersheds in the area, so areas of land that drain to a particular creek that are at higher risk for community flooding, which we anticipate to increase due to climate change. So this program is just the beginning of a series of educational events and engagement activities we do to help homeowners in these areas change their landscape to promote more watershed health. And we're going to tell you way more specific ways on how to do that during the next 50 minutes or so. But thanks to the City of Kitchener for sponsoring tonight's event. So for tonight, to figure out how you can nurture nature in your neighborhood, we're going to relatively quickly go over the why. I imagine many of you have a reason already, and you're here because of that. So Erin and I are going to share some of our main reasons why we think this is important, and then spend the most time talking about how. So our goal is to give you 5 pretty clear ways that you could approach nurturing nature in your yard this year. And hopefully you'll leave here with at least one concrete idea of what you can do this spring. And we'll leave you with a few resources and ways we could help support you on that journey. So as I just said, we'll start with why. Why do we need to nurture nature in our urban neighborhoods? All of these pictures were taken from my urban neighborhood in downtown Kitchener. So there is a lot of nature already. We'll show you a few reasons why it's not quite as abundant as we'd like and why we need to make it even more abundant than it already is. So the first reason, yards can support wildlife. Right now we're facing an unprecedented loss of biodiversity globally, and even in Ontario. There are over 200 species at risk in Ontario today, which includes many pollinators and birds that don't rely on huge swaths of habitat, but can actually survive with patchy habitat like you might find in a residential area or neighborhood. So when we think of kind of larger mammals, a wolf or a wolverine or something that we know is endangered, we think of conservation areas or big provincial or national parks needed for big habitat for them. There's way more species at risk that require or can survive with smaller fragmented habitat. So that's something like a low-hanging fruit. We have a capacity to support those animals in our existing landscapes without a huge change in our development patterns and our lifestyle if we just shift a little bit of the way we steward our own land. So you can see here 2 contrasting views, but of an urban landscape that you might be familiar with. While one is much more attractive than the other, more appealing for living, they're both ecologically barren or low ecological value because of the few number of species of plants in both of these images and the non-native nature of the plants that are present here. And so this is a little journey I've grabbed from a story from the Washington Post that came out a couple years ago about the role of patchy habitat in supporting pollinators and native insects. And so I'm going to walk you through it. You can check out the link at the bottom if you wanted to look. The article's quite good, but this is just a snippet from it. So here is a butterfly, a monarch butterfly. It's traveling through backyards and it feasts on native plants and flowers that are present in the backyard. Here on the left, it's traveling quite a long distance, as you know. Monarchs migrate quite a far way in their lifespan. A planter on an apartment balcony can be a life-saving stop for an insect like this. Most of us know that a species like the monarch butterfly has a pretty narrow range of food options in terms of the nectar that it likes, the flowers it's able to drink from, even more narrow range of plants where it can lay its eggs because the caterpillars are really picky eaters. So this type of plants we offer are important. And even if you're in a neighborhood with lots of gardening, there might be very few stops of the right species to support this particular wildlife. So a planter on a balcony like this could truly provide a life-saving stop for one of these charismatic insects. But a lawn is a desert. So this monarch's finding itself in a desert, much like the first picture I showed a few slides ago of that pretty nice looking lawn. When I see a lawn, I used to see a nice green lawn that was like a desirable outcome, but now through lots of years of education, I see an ecological desert. And the more stops we offer this butterfly, the more we help. So what we're hoping to do tonight is to show various ways we can offer help and stops for the wildlife that could occupy our neighborhoods. The second reason we need to nurture nature in our own neighborhoods is we need to prepare for weird weather. Doesn't matter how much forest we preserve in northern Ontario or how well we buffer the Grand River if you live far away from it. Those are important things to do, and I advocate for both of those things. But when weather descends upon our own neighborhood, the nature that's present there is what will protect us from some of these weird patterns. So while it's important to have a big picture view of conservation and adaptation to climate change, what we're doing right in our own yards will help us adapt to this weird weather. So a few years ago, we'd have to explain what to expect with climate change. And sadly, over the last 4-5 years, we don't really have to explain that. It's everyday noticeable what happens in the winters and summers. It's different from when folks were growing up here. So we're seeing more extreme heat, we're seeing more intense rains, wetter, warmer winters. This winter's no exception, but we're already preparing for a drought-full summer. So the nature in our neighborhood will help buffer us against some of these weird weather patterns, and we'll explain a little bit more about that in detail when we talk about the 5 ways you can nurture nature in your neighborhood. Here's an example of a creek in Kitchener, 2 different creeks, and what happens when we experience a heavy rain. So like I said, these things are happening now, and we're realizing right now that our infrastructure is not well suited for these weather patterns and the changes we're seeing with climate change. And this is a real risk. Flood risk is a real thing that is affecting homeowners all over the city, not just folks who live on a creek, but also anyone who lives near a storm drain, which is basically everyone. Because when these pipe systems and creeks reach capacity during a heavy rain, water can back up those pipes into the street where we live, even if you're quite far, not thinking about creeks. And so things we can do in our yard to help slow runoff down and soak it up into the soil will help us prepare for these climate futures and present day scenarios. And so what we're trying to help people understand in the community and help facilitate is lots of little changes. So there's a lot going on in this graphic. The top images are sort of status quo, and this is a real neighborhood in Kitchener we've just used as a model. You can see the residential landscape on the top left is pretty typical. Water flows off the roof, down the driveway, and into a storm drain. However, the more impermeable surfaces we have and the heavier rains we get, the pipe system that carries that water away from our homes is getting to capacity and sometimes over capacity. And you see flooding in streets like you do in the second picture to the left. At the end of the pipe, when that water that does reach the stormwater system flows into the creek, you can see those runoff or the bursting water out of the pipe into the creek, which causes erosion, terribly degrades the wildlife habitat and the water quality in the creek, and causes this kind of murky water you can see on the far right. So water or habitat degradation and lower water quality in both the creeks and ultimately the Grand River. And so our main mission with the Rain Smart Neighborhoods program is to help community members in some of these highest risk areas of the city understand that changes you can make in your yard, like you see on the bottom left, can reduce the amount of water that needs to go into the pipe system. The water that does go into the pipe system is slower, cleaner, there's less of it. And so when it comes out of that pipe into the creek, it's a much more hospitable environment for the animals that live in that creek and riparian area. There's less flood risk down in the creek. And as the water flows through the creek into the Grand River, it's a higher water quality and higher quality of wildlife habitat. And Aaron's going to take over for the third reason.
Yeah, so this last one is mainly about biodiversity and how biodiversity improves our ability to battle against climate change mainly. Our changing climate is directly linked to the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. It's a pretty well understood phenomenon. We've all heard of global warming, and we know what greenhouse gases are. So carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, those are really potent greenhouse gases. Methane and carbon dioxide both have carbon in them. So thinking about biodiversity and how much carbon is stored in our atmosphere and in our land and marine ecosystems really is crucial to understanding the future impacts. So this makes me and hopefully us ask, how do we maximize that carbon storage and sequestration, which is really that capturing of carbon from the atmosphere. And that's where biodiversity comes in. So ecosystems with more diverse species have been shown to be more resilient to disturbances. So this article here links to the UN panel on climate change, and it goes into a lot of detail about how resilient biodiverse ecosystems are the backbone of carbon storage and sequestration. I don't find it very hard to understand that just by looking around our own neighborhoods as well. So in our first example here, is on Kane Street in Waterloo. I took this picture back in 2022, the one on the right. And this is an example of a row of ash trees that unfortunately succumbed to an emerald ash borer, which is an invasive insect in Ontario. So what happened likely 50 years ago or so is that the city planners decided to put a row of beautiful ash trees on the street. And obviously, one single species isn't really diverse. So now we're starting to pay the price because one single insect can basically single-handedly take out the entire urban forest in this stretch. We give the insect basically a buffet when they're able to just hop from one tree down to the next in a giant boulevard like this, which is where promoting diversity and things really comes to be helpful. So I think it's just interesting to understand a little bit more about how those borers work. So the picture down on the bottom left kind of shows some squiggly lines that they leave behind, and that's really disrupting the crucial outer layer of the tree trunk, which is where water and nutrients are conducted from the roots up into the crown. So this picture on the right, the bottom right, shows an ash tree stump near Pioneer Park Library. And after they cut it down, those ash will still produce a ton of growth because the roots are healthy, the tree is healthy because it has like a ton of stored energy. It doesn't have a disease or anything. It just has that main trunk, the main highway for the nutrients and water is completely blocked. It's yeah, I kind of like the example of comparing it to a highway during rush hour where there's an accident that's completely closed things down. There's no way to get through. So there's still lots of energy in the roots, but the tree really can't make it past that, which is really disappointing. So we see an image on the left where there's a pretty healthy ash forest just over a decade ago, and now has been, yeah, within those 10 years completely removed. And hopefully the city is working towards recovering some of that canopy. But there's a huge expense associated with cutting down, as a first step, cutting down all those trees, and as a second step, replacing them with new trees. So in Ontario, there's a number of different species that are kind of becoming bigger issues, different invasive species, and that main note about biodiversity is still a problem, frankly. So in the city of Kitchener, 43% of our trees are in the maple genus. That may not come as a huge surprise. Maple trees are pretty common, but I dread thinking about something like a maple borer that could, take out roughly half of our urban forest. So the economic and various impacts from that kind of a situation would be really devastating. Which is why it's really good to promote that diversity. And we'll kind of circle back to that topic a little bit later as well. But to transition to the next section, we're going to talk about some really specific ways that your yard or neighborhood can help for these challenges. So I like this image. This is taken in Waterloo as well. And it kind of shows how one individual yard can be combined with a whole neighborhood to try to emulate and reproduce the benefits that we get from a natural area. So it's obviously not going to be quite the same level of benefits, but we'll still be able to do something. So in terms of benefits and specific things we can do, it may not be a surprise that the greatest way to maintain carbon storage is by protecting our existing assets, which means caring for existing trees. So I tried to find a way to show all the different benefits that trees provide, but I couldn't really fit it on one slide. So I could go on for a while for that one, but I'll let you just kind of read through some of those. And then there's a few that I want to kind of specifically talk about in terms of carbon storage and carbon sequestration. So our next graphic is from the City of Kitchener's Sustainable Urban Forest Strategy. It shows the costs associated with maintaining trees and then the benefits associated that we get from them. In terms of ecosystem services, really that whole list is increasing as a tree gets older. So when a tree is fully mature, for most hardwood species, that's around 60 to 80 years. That's when we're starting to get the most benefits in terms of the most shade, the most ecosystem services, the most carbon sequestration, and the most carbon storage. So again, it may not be surprising that an oak tree that's 50 feet tall and 50 feet wide stores a huge amount of carbon. All the molecules in the leaves and the trunk are made up of carbon, and it actively takes in carbon from the atmosphere every single day. So many mature trees can far outlive that 80 to 100 year timeline as well, like this red oak. So I love this picture of this oak in Toronto. It's estimated to be one of the oldest in the cities, and it's estimated to be roughly 300 years old, which means it came long before that house. I think the story is that they put on an addition and didn't quite realize how big the tree would get. But thankfully, the house is being taken down now to make a little more room for the tree, which I think is a good option. A large tree like this oak can soak up almost 400 liters of water in a day and release it back to the atmosphere. So when we think back to those images that Becca showed of stormwater working its way through a neighborhood, an oak tree like this does a really great job of slowing that stormwater, both during the storm event and then afterwards to release it back to the atmosphere. So unfortunately, it's not always an option to tear down the house to preserve a nice tree. Obviously, we all need to have somewhere to live as well. But there are ways that we can try and maximize the time that a tree can be kept on the landscape. So the graphic on the left is a bit of a guideline to the basics around tree pruning. This would be more relevant for pruning smaller trees. And if you're looking at, if you have a large tree on your property, I'd really recommend calling in a certified arborist to do an assessment. And that may involve some more technical skills related to pruning. But for smaller trees, and if you are working with an arborist, it can be good to know certain things. A general rule is to never remove more than 20 to 25% of the tree's canopy. So that's just kind of like giving a healthy dose to the tree without overstressing it. Dead or diseased branches don't count towards that percentage. So if there's a lot of dead wood in the tree, that can all just be taken out because it isn't contributing anymore. Other things to look for is just to maintain a healthy structure. So you want one central leader that has scaffold branches being supported by that leader. Another thing to look for could be kind of some minor pruning at the edges to kind of maintain the uniformity and shape of the tree. So that's kind of like tucking in the edges and just reducing the load on some of those branches. And for that kind of visual, I like to think of carrying a box around. And if you fully extend your arms and carry the box out in front of yourself, the weight is going to be so much more difficult to carry than if you held the box close to your body. So that's similar for trees when they have overextended branches and things. That's what leads to branch failure. Another aspect can be clearing out the interior of the crown. So some trees that are super dense can act as a giant sail. When they get hit by a big windstorm, they really buffet against that wind, and the air can't really filter through. So removing some interior growth allows for some better airflow, and the tree can kind of shrug off some of the energy that comes from a windstorm. So caring for existing trees is our first method to how we can nurture nature, and the second relates to planting trees. So if you don't have trees on your property to care for, planting trees is kind of the next best option. That may be unsurprising. So at the end, we'll discuss a program that Reep has related to trees and planting trees. But I want to discuss a few things that are interesting to keep in mind for tree planting. The species I have highlighted here is Kentucky coffee tree. So this tree is a part of the Carolinian forest, which means we're kind of right at the northern edge of its suitable habitat. However, as we keep in mind our changing climate, it's important to think about what trees will be doing best here in 20 to 30 years if we have an accelerated climate that becomes warmer and wetter. So realistically, our climate can be more like Kentucky in the next 20 years, which means we may need to start planting more Kentucky coffee trees now so that 20 years from now, they've been well adjusted to our current conditions. That's also true for selecting trees from seeds. So even though we have a lot of red oaks in this area, it might be prudent to start selecting red oaks from Kentucky because they'll be more adapted to those conditions in that climate. So that's called assisted tree migration. Really, that's kind of left up to the professionals, but that's something to keep in mind when you're thinking about tree planting. So some kind of other facts that I like to share about Kentucky coffee trees are their really unique seed pods. So the seeds used to be consumed by the American mastodon and other extinct mammals, which had really strong stomach acid, which would break down that exterior coating of the seed and allow the seed to germinate. However, with these animals, there aren't many seeds breaking down anymore, and the trees are rarely able to reproduce. So that's just one of the reasons that the coffee tree is now a species at risk in Ontario. So it's also important to discuss how trees help pollinators. Something I'm really aware of this year is how mild and turbulent our winter and spring has been, with some days being 15 degrees in February, and then days at the end of March being, -5. It's really tough for trees and plants to keep up with that kind of swing. So we have a lot of trees that are blooming really early this year, which can be good for things like bees and other pollinators that rely on that kind of breakfast after they've been hibernating for a long winter. However, it's also important to, a Canadian serviceberry is an example of a really early bloomer and a red maple. They're some of the first meals that pollinators will have in the spring. But it's also important to remember that that kind of turbulent weather with frosts going later and later into April and March can also kill off flowers. So certain trees are a little more at risk of that kind of damage from frost in the spring, which leads me to an American basswood. So this tree is a late bloomer. It blooms more like in the middle of June, which is also good for other pollinators because many other species have finished their blooming, but then the basswood is kind of just ramping up. So if we really promoted species like Canadian serviceberry and red maple, and then had certain winters that had a really late frost, we would have much less pollination and much less trees being able to reproduce. So that just goes back to our point about biodiversity and why that's really important in maintaining healthy ecosystems. So I'll switch it over to Becca again, who's going to talk about more ways that you can increase biodiversity on your property.
Thanks, Aaron. Yeah, so existing trees, we need to care for them as our first action, first priority. If you have those in your yard or in your neighborhood, you can become their advocate. Protecting our existing assets is really important. Planting trees, next best thing. You'd be surprised to read about the number of wildlife species that a tree like a white oak can support. Like we often think milkweed, pollinators, which is true. However, if you really want to pack a punch to support pollinators, some of the best plants to plant would be trees. So learning about your tree species options, which Reep can help you with, is a really important way to consider the best, most efficient way you can support wildlife. So our third strategy tonight, increase biodiversity with native plants. So that includes trees, of course, which Aaron's already spoke of. But there's all kinds of other native plants that are more exciting gardening-wise, I think, that I'm going to talk about now. So you might look at this picture and think this is a terrible example of how to increase biodiversity with native plants, but this is my before image. So when I first moved into my house in Kitchener, it was kind of sterile, very few species. So I could probably write on a piece of paper, walk around the yard and find like maybe 10 max different species of plant. Many of which were conifers, so almost indistinguishable, unless you're really into conifers. So that's something you could think about doing as things are poking out of the soil in the next few weeks and months, and start looking at the number of individual species you have on your property and think of if that's enough diversity to support the wildlife that we have in the area or could have with all the weird weather. And as Aaron's mentioned, diversity is the key to resilience. We'll have the more plant species we have on our property, the more likely something will survive the weird weather and be blooming or flowering at the right time to support wildlife when it needs it. So let's see, sorry. Here's a little diagram that shows some of our native plants in Southern Ontario. You can see on the far left, little green squiggles and the little black squiggles is turf grass. And people who have ever been to any of my workshops know I show this every single time. So sorry if it's a repeat for anyone, but it's so compelling. I really like to share it. This grass stinks in terms of biomass above ground and below ground, and stinks big time for habitat. There's just not enough of it to create much habitat for many organisms. There's very little plant material to intercept rain when it falls, and there's very little root to draw water up from the ground during periods of drought or to help water filter through the soil during heavy rains. It's really just not ticking a lot of boxes ecologically. That being said, there is a time and a place for lawn. We'll talk about that a little later. So we're not anti-lawn completely, but when you have an opportunity to replace lawn with a native perennial or grass, that's a great opportunity to nurture nature, support wildlife, and slow rain down and manage your stormwater. So I'm going to show you a few kind of examples of how to get started. So we meet with homeowners all the time. We've met with, upwards of 300, 350 homeowners in the last 2-3 years who want to do something like this, something positive with their landscape, but aren't really sure how to get started. And that can be hard. Sometimes people want to just I don't want any grass to mow, but it's really hard to create a aesthetically appealing residential landscape all at once without hiring a design professional, in my opinion. So here are a few ways to get started. So this is an example of a corporate landscape in town that had a really nice formal woody plant landscape, but not a lot of diversity. And so we took this existing tree, which is beautiful shape and form, had a small mulch circle around it. We expanded the mulch circle by 1 meter all the way around and then underplanted it with dry shade tolerant native ground covers. So some ferns, some foam flower, and some woodland aster. So that's 3 different native plants that bloom at different times. They're offering nectar to insects throughout the growing season. And a really easy way to just increase the diversity of this landscape without totally rethinking the design of it. So I did something similar in my landscape, which I'll show you here. So back to the before, we had a nice existing curve of this kind of foundation planting, which many of us have. It's a really common way to get started with landscaping a residential yard. So I took that line that's existing and just extended it, I think 3 meters. I'm right here, I'm playing around with a garden hose to lay it out, which is a really great strategy for kind of designing on the fly. It's not permanent and you can play around with the curves and lay it out and think about it for a few days before you actually cut into the ground and start making changes. So really without a lot of creativity, I got rid of quite a bit of grass in my front yard and allowed for space to plant, let's see, at least 10 different native plant species in this area. So I added a layer of dwarf red osier dogwoods shrubs in front of the conifers and planted a whole whack of different flowering perennials on the other side of the walkway here and kind of anchored with a repeating pattern of little blue stem grasses. So I thought a lot about the timing of the blooms for all of these different plants so that I was offering a flower with nectar from as early as I could till as late as I could. So early mid-spring to late fall. And then also leaving or including some grasses like little blue stem that I would leave up year round, so that there is a habitat for any insects that overwinter here and need to find stems or sticks to burrow into to survive the winter. So this is, again, just a reminder to think about seasonality. So if you like take my suggestion of walking around and writing down the different species you see in your yard, maybe you'll realize you want to add more. Keep going on that list, write down the ones you'd like to include. And what I do when I'm writing my list is also have a column for when it blooms and how long it blooms. So I can look down my list and make sure I have at least one thing blooming during all weeks of the growing season. And that's kind of a fun puzzle to solve too with a plant book or two or a good plant nursery website. And the bonus of thinking about seasonality is that you can also create some really pretty winter aesthetics as well. So the red osier dogwood I mentioned previously offers a nice visual appeal in the winter, the red twigs against the conifers. And like I mentioned, leaving up grasses is an important way to provide habitat for any overwintering insects or birds or mammals, I suppose, too. So the fourth of our 5 actions, soak up rain from your downspouts. So we're talking a lot about supporting wildlife. We've also talked a lot about climate change and increased frequency of rainfalls and increased intensity of rainfalls. And so managing stormwater on our own property will become really important for this area as we adapt to climate change. Luckily, the way you can handle that goes hand in hand with diversity and protecting wildlife. Both by keeping stormwater on our property, we're protecting wildlife at the end of our pipes in the creeks where our water would typically go, by way of sending less water and slower and cleaner to the creek. But we can also create landscapes on our property that soak up water and enable us to have even more diversity in plants. So I'll explain why. So on the other side of my sidewalk there, I did the one project I just showed you. On the flip side, I kind of mirrored the same shape of a landscape bed in front of the conifers I have at the base of the house and created a rain garden. So this area that's in the overturned grass area, I've turned into a depression. And then I've turned my downspout. It was going kind of perpendicular to this main sidewalk off to the side, but I turned it 90 degrees. So it was shooting out towards parallel with this front sidewalk, going out towards my rain garden. So now half of my house, all the rain falling on my house is flowing out of that downspout and into a bowl, kind of a recessed garden area where I've amended the soil to be really sandy and well draining. And so all of that runoff flows into the rain garden and soaks quickly into the soil instead of running through my yard and into the storm sewer. So here's a different perspective of a rain garden. Like I mentioned, it's kind of a dish-shaped or recessed bowl in the landscape, downstream from a point source of water like a downspout, and amended soil so that it's really well draining and water flows into it and soaks down within a few hours after a rain. So the goal is it would be completely drained within 24 hours of a heavy rain. My rain garden soaks, you don't ever see water, it's drained so quickly. I never see standing water. So we have pretty sandy soil in many locations within Kitchener, so it's pretty easy to soak up rain if you just adjust your downspouts and your topography a little bit. And now there's a certain suite of native plants that really like rain gardens that couldn't survive in other areas of my yard. So plants like Joe Pieweed and blue flag iris and different sedges, all kinds of plants, swamp milkweed, really like these wet conditions, but can also tolerate drought conditions in between rain. So there's not as many plants that like that variability. So it's important to check your plant list, and Reep can help you with that as well. But it gives you an opportunity to bring some more diversity to your yard by creating this kind of microclimate. Here's an example of a different rain garden. We worked with a church in Kitchener to install, just to show you what it would look like after a couple of years. So the image I showed before was freshly planted. This one's been installed for a few years when I took this, and has an interesting combination of native and non-native plants. So you can see obviously brown-eyed Susan and echinacea. There's a lot of blue flag iris in the center part, and fox sedge in the center, but then there's some non-natives like hostas and fountain grasses. So if you're really new to native plant gardening, I think it's a great strategy to mix in natives and non-natives, as long as you're not mixing in natives with invasives. So don't be overwhelmed with the concept of native gardening. You can start with a couple of species and keep what you have and just mix in more new species to increase the diversity. And our final strategy for nurturing nature in your landscape, after you've taken care of your existing trees, maybe remove some lawn to plant a new tree, remove some lawn to install some native plant perennials and grasses, and remove some more lawn to install a rain garden and absorb your stormwater, you might have some lawn left. And I definitely did. There's a time and a place for lawn, and we don't expect everyone to get rid of it. So we'll go through a couple of ways to increase the diversity and reduce the resource intensivity of lawn for the areas where you do want to keep that. So there's a interesting article. You can see the link at the bottom of the screen there, the source of it at least, a few years ago, about a neighborhood that stopped mowing their lawns in May. This has become like very slightly controversial in the recent years, mainly because it's a little bit of an oversimplification of pollinators. But basically, if we can not be quite so obsessed with like a perfectly manicured lawn and allow the plants in our lawn to go to flower, we can support quite a few more pollinators during the year and during the time of year when these plants are flowering. You can see here, this is clover. The reason it's like slightly controversial is that some of the plants that tolerate lawn, life in a lawn the best aren't necessarily native. So there are some native options and some non-native options to consider when trying to diversify your lawn. Of course, you want to choose species that can handle some light foot traffic, potentially can handle the odd mowing, and that are aesthetically pleasing. If you're having a lawn, that's probably because you're looking for a particular aesthetic. So this here you can see it's clover, but you could also consider overseeding your existing lawn with perennial rye or fescue grass. And those are two native options that are less resource intensive than like a Kentucky bluegrass. So we're looking for grass species that have deeper roots, require less watering. The roots being deeper allows them to access water from further in the soil horizon. So during periods of drought, they won't die, like some species you find in sod from the garden center. And so a way to get started if you're looking to improve the diversity of your lawn would be to, pretty soon here is a good time of year to do this. There's not that many gardening projects I'd recommend to do very soon, but this is one if you're super keen to get started. Heavily rake your existing lawn and what you're planning to keep after you do all of our other suggestions. To get the thatch out, you're trying to expose some bare soil so that you can sow seeds in that soil. Overdress the lawn after you've done that with compost or topsoil. I just did compost, so a mix of manure and compost from my backyard composter. So you're just adding nutrients to the remaining soil that you've exposed with your heavy raking. And then for me, I overseeded. So I didn't get rid of my grass completely. I removed the thatch, overdressed with soil, and then sprinkled a white clover mix on top of my lawn, just to increase the diversity and to put a nitrogen fixing plant in the lawn that had a more robust root system and more biomass above ground. So more green, more roots, less work. And this particular type of clover kind of maxes out in height. So I found it to be a really nice way to reduce the maintenance of my lawn. I don't have to mow it as much. It's kind of growing in harmony with what was left of the lawn before, which wasn't particularly healthy. And this does take mowing. So every now and then, if you really want a shorn lawn look, you can mow this and it recovers pretty easily. And we just try not to mow it during when it's flowering so that pollinators can enjoy the flowers. And bunnies, it's kind of a nice way to lure bunnies out of your garden where you don't want them to eat other things. So here are just a few tips and resources if you're interested in this strategy. There's lots of literature online and products. I find the TRCA has a really kind of unbiased approach to growing a healthy lawn. It's a good place to get started. It's the Toronto Region Conservation Authority. And then there's a couple of places that you could find some alternative seed mixes to try. Wildflower Farm and Ontario Seed Company are places I like to browse and look at alternatives for seed mix. That's where I got my white clover. And this is kind of a burgeoning industry. There's all kinds of interesting clover species coming out, different heights and different tolerance of foot traffic and things like that. So a little bit of a wormhole for learning on the internet. A few other resources I just wanted to mention if you're interested in some of these strategies. Finding a really good native plant resource is helpful. So the Canadian Wildlife Federation Native Plant Encyclopedia could be a good place to start. These kind of native plant lookups allow you to type in like what your conditions are, and they'll help you narrow down to a few plants that would tolerate that. So it's important to think about where you're planting plants and what the conditions are there. Let's say it's heavy shade and really wet because there's a downspout nearby. So you can narrow down the hundreds of native plants to just a few to choose from that are suitable for those conditions and available in a commercial nursery. And this canplant.ca is a good place to go and find local nurseries in the area. So if you're wanting to go see plants in person, this is a good way to see what nurseries might be closest to you. And so before we take some questions, I see a couple in the Q&A. Please feel free to type some questions in there, and Erin and I will moderate them to each other in a few minutes. This is the first of our three-part webinar series on healthy yards. The next webinar we have will be rain garden design and construction. So if you're interested in that strategy we talked about tonight, this will be a much more detailed workshop on how exactly to size and locate a rain garden and how to design a planting plan for it. So really specific, the goal would be like you leave with a really fine-tuned plan for how to design and construct a rain garden in your yard. And then the last webinar is gardening in the right of way. So thinking about boulevards, how can you increase the diversity and appeal of your boulevard through native planting? So that's kind of a hot topic and an easy way to get started with native plant gardening. If you find redesigning your landscape in the front yard or the backyard a little overwhelming, a strip of grass in the right of way is a easy way to start. And like I mentioned, this program was sponsored by the Rain Smart Neighborhoods program. So you can see here the areas in blue are the sub-watersheds in Kitchener where we are operating this program. So all of these dots you see here are homes where we have visited and provided a 1-hour consultation to homeowners who are interested in changing their landscape to improve watershed health. So if you live in Kitchener and in one of these blue areas, you can get in touch with us and schedule a consultation if you would like to have some more specific advice on the best project and the best way to do it in your property. So you can see the website at the bottom there. There is a map on our website. You can type in your address and it will quickly show whether you're in the target area or not. And we'll be running that program for the next few years, but we'll start doing consultations here in the middle of April and through the fall. Here are just a couple examples of projects people have done through the Rain Smart Neighborhoods program. So where we've gone to houses, provided a consultation, and then homeowners are making real changes in their neighborhood. So we're really proud to see these changes sprinkled all over the city of Kitchener. And would love to see more. All right, I'm almost done. Right now we're running our Bloom and Box sale. So if you're interested in some of the strategies we talked about tonight, and you're not as interested in researching plant species, this is kind of an easy way to incorporate native plants in your yard. We've done a lot of the hard work. So we offer a bloom in rain, shade, or sun kit. You can purchase these at the website you see on the screen. You can pick rain, sun, or shade, depending on what condition you have in your yard. Rain would be for rain gardens. And you would get 15 plant plugs, 3 of 5 different species you see on the screen here. The top row are the plants in our rain box. The middle row are the plants in our shade box. And the bottom row are the plants in our sun box. So a nice way to get native plants in your yard, pretty easy. You order and pay now and pick up on May 25th at the Reep House. And as Erin mentioned, we also have our backyard tree planting program. So if that was the strategy that's called to you the most, you can get in touch with us at the website below to register your interest in our backyard tree planting program. This program comes with a full service visit from an arborist to help you decide the right tree in the right place in your yard, because our goal is to plant trees that will reach maturity and be part of a healthy urban forest canopy. So it's really important to us to educate homeowners and help them choose the best species and the best location in your property. So we're not doing any house removal, like Erin showed earlier, to enable the tree to grow to full size. And that service also comes with the planting. So we'd come back and plant the tree for you as well. And the cost of the tree is subsidized by the city of Kitchener. And so with that, I'll say thank you for your attention so far and for joining us. And we'll take a look at the questions. All right. So, will we provide a list of native plants? We can send around a copy of the links from the presentation, which is also a question I see below. There'd be too many native plants to share on one list, but we can include those links I showed earlier, maybe a couple more. There's some really good books if you just Googled like Southern Ontario native plants that I could include some recommendations in the follow-up email we'll send in the next probably Monday at this point or Tuesday. But we do have a rain garden plant list on our website. So if you're thinking about a rain garden, you could specifically look at that plant list. Where can you get perennial rye or fescue grass? I have had the most luck with the widest range of seeds at Ontario Seed Company, which is in the Home Hardware in Uptown Waterloo, among other places. But I think that's the best like commercial retail space for citizens like us. I was told you come to the house for consultation. Yes, that's true. So like I said before, if you check our Rain Smart Neighborhoods website, you can see if you live in one of our target areas and you can register interest for a consultation. We don't currently consult in Waterloo for that program, but we do for backyard tree planting. So Erin would love to help you with that. Oh, here's a good question for you, Erin. Kitchener has been planting collars, pear trees on boulevards and new neighborhoods. Have you undertaken any education with the city about avoiding these invasive trees?
Yeah, that is a really good question. And yeah, calorie pear, also called like a Bradford pear, is I don't know if it's officially listed as an invasive tree in Ontario, but in a lot of other places, especially in the States, it is listed as invasive. So that's, yeah, somewhat disappointing for me to hear that they're still planting something like that. But I would suspect that they, in certain areas under power lines or things, we're really limited in terms of the amount of species that we can plant. So smaller stature trees like serviceberry won't ever grow into those power lines and require a lot of maintenance. So that'd be where something like a more ornamental tree, like a calorie pear, is also a good option. So unfortunately, there isn't a huge list of those kind of smaller stature native trees. So occasionally the city will have to resort to other species that are to kind of enhance that biodiversity. Even though calorie pears are invasive, in certain urban areas, they're not super likely to spread to like a naturalized area. Um, but but yeah, hopefully they'd be prioritizing things like service berries and yeah, not non-native trees.
Interesting.
And yeah, regarding consults, we don't do the Rain Smart neighborhoods in outside of Kitchener, but then the backyard tree program and our Bloomin' boxes are available for anybody in Cambridge, Waterloo, Kitchener, or Guelph.
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So I mentioned Kitchener subsidizing the trees for the backyard tree planting program. And yes, as Aaron just said, whoops, all of the municipalities you see here offer the same thing. So definitely available for Waterloo residents, which there's a couple of questions on that. Do you have any species to recommend for underplanting on a mature tree? I would say it's important to look for a shade tolerant but dry shade tolerant plant to go under a mature tree. Obviously, well, maybe not obviously, but trees prevent quite a bit of rain from hitting the ground. So if you're underplanting an existing tree, it'll be very dry, likely underneath it. So for example, there's a lot of fern species. Wood fern or Christmas fern is dry shade tolerant. Ostrich fern can grow in standing water. So it's just important to check those type of details before you purchase the plant. And the other thing I'd say is the size of your plant is probably important when you're planting under a mature tree. Like as Aaron hopefully distilled for you tonight, trees are super duper important. So we would never want to disturb the roots of a tree. So if you're getting like a gallon size plant from a garden center, I would say that's not well suited to plant under a mature tree because you'd have to disturb a lot of the roots to dig a hole for it. So when I would be, if I were planting under a mature tree, I would look for a very small plant stock, even seed, so it can grow in the soil that's available and not require a lot of digging or disturbing the roots.
There's another question a little higher up, Becca, about like safely emptying a backyard pool so it doesn't just go directly down to the storm drain. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I see that quite a bit too, like a hose just snaking down the driveway. Yeah, I would say doing that, watching the best thing people could do who have to empty their pool is watch the weather and not do it within 24 hours of a rain event. If we can reduce the peak flow of water coming into our pipe systems and out the end of the pipe into the creek, then that's really helpful. So doing it during a dry period probably would be negligible to the creek, because not that much water is flowing out of the pipes into the creek at that point. Anytime you can allow that water to flow over soil of any kind, the better. But you're right, it's often just down the driveway right into the storm drain. So, and then I would, yeah, at least one day outside of a rain event would be the most important priority.
There's another question. You had a slide earlier with that blooming white tree. Do you know what that species was?
Yeah, so that's not a native exactly. It's a like a cultivated version. It's a crab apple, which is but a dwarf crab apple. So I really love native plants, but there's definitely times when I don't have them in my yard because of the size of them. So for me, it's a blend of increasing diversity and never trying my best to choose good species, but not always native. But yeah, that was a dwarf crabapple. Although I do see a comment down here I'm gonna have to look into. So clover considered invasive on the CVC website, which is a good source. Has been discovered in natural woodlots in the city. Yeah, so I think that seems pretty interesting and valid. I would have to look into that more, obviously. There are other native options, like I mentioned, perennial rye and fescue. But however, I'm not sure those are purely native. It's difficult to get a purely native grass seed that would grow in a lawn that can take foot traffic. So I think if you're really, the best thing you can do is minimize your lawn to the degree that you can. And then I will certainly look into the clover issue a little bit further. So thanks for bringing that up. Heritage Park area, not in the target area. So the city of Kitchener undertook stormwater master plan exercise, and they evaluated all of the creeks in the city and sub watersheds around them and gave them like a report card. And so what we're doing is working in the 10 lowest grades in the city. So depending on the Heritage Park area, just didn't rank as bad as other areas on important metrics like forest cover, presence of wetlands, riparian, like vegetation around creeks, and a few other metrics that would indicate a healthy watershed. I don't know that particular area very well, so I can't be more specific than that. And the last question I see here, underplanting a mature pine tree. That's true. That's hard. Ferns don't live. So yeah, it's pretty acidic. I don't have a good suggestion, to be honest, off the top of my head, but you could probably search something like with that metric. So acidic soil, probably dry soil, and shade tolerant. If you could put that in the Native Plant Encyclopedia, or onplants.ca is another, it's a nursery website that has a good plant lookup. Potentially you could get some suggestions there.
And also try to minimize how acidic that soil is by potentially removing some of the pine needles that are going to be decomposing there, and trying to boost the soil with, like Becca said, a kind of compost loam mix. So that'll just make sure that there's still lots of nutrients, so that the plants can still do okay.
Good suggestion.
Yeah, there's also one other last question about doing a rain garden under like a pear tree, as that's just where some of their drainage ends up.
It's difficult to install a rain garden near an existing tree, just because to install a rain garden, you have to dig and remove some soil to get that basin shape, and that could be detrimental to the tree roots. As Aaron mentioned, trees do quite a bit of stormwater management, so we are not, we would never like recommend a rain garden at the expense of a tree. Oftentimes I would recommend putting a rain garden before the problem area where the drainage ends up, so that you're kind of preventing the problem slightly uphill from that spot. So maybe if you can consider that, if there's a spot between the downspout and the low point where it sounds like the tree is, that might be a more suitable location anyhow for a rain garden, to capture water, soak it up before it flows the rest of the way down to the low point. And you can put trees in rain gardens, but at the beginning, so that the tree, certain species of trees will be more than happy to live in or around a rain garden, but they would just need to be planted in conjunction with the digging so that they're used to the topography. Once it's installed, it's more difficult to do it after the fact. Great. I think we got all the questions. Lovely. Well, thanks everybody for joining us tonight. Please consider coming to the other webinars that we've got planned if any of the ideas you'd like to detail out a bit further. And we'll send out an email in the next, like I said, probably Tuesday at this point, with a summary of some of our ideas here and some links that we've mentioned throughout the presentation. So have a great long weekend and happy gardening.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.